Welcome to the 25th Annual Spring Henry George Seminar. My name is Christos Pargianas. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Economics and Finance. Before I introduce the speaker, I would like to thank those who have made this event possible. First of all, the members of the Henry George Committee of the Department of Economics and Finance, Dr. Scahill, Dr. Petsas, Dr. Kalianiotis, Dr. Ghosh, Dr. Balagiosian, and Dr. Kai. Also, Janice Mekadon, who is the administrative assistant of the Department of Economics and Finance, and the students of the Omicron Delta Epsilon Honor Society in Economics. Last but not least, I would like to express my gratitude to the Sakenbach Foundation for this continuous financial support. Okay. The lecture will go for about an hour, and then there is going to be time for questions. Okay. Our speaker today is Dr. Edward O'Donnell. Dr. O'Donnell is a professional historian, author, and speaker. He earned his bachelor's degree from Holy Cross College in Worcester, Massachusetts, and his PhD in American history from Columbia University. He is an associate professor of history at Holy Cross College in Worcester, Massachusetts. Dr. O'Donnell is the author of several books, including Visions of America, A History of the United States, 1001 Things Everyone Should Know About Irish American History, and The Henry George and the Crisis of Inequality, Progress and Poverty in the Gilded Age America. Actually, it is a great pleasure to have with us today a speaker for whom Henry George is one of the main research interests. Dr. O'Donnell is also a professional speaker, delivering history-themed presentations since 1991. During his years in New York City, he also led more than 1,200 walking tours through New York City's ethnic neighborhoods, such as Chinatown, Little Italy, and Harlem. Dr. O'Donnell has provided historical insight and commentary for programs airing on PBS, the History Channel, the Discovery Channel, C-SPAN, ABC World News Now, National Public Radio, the BBC, and Bloomberg Radio, among others. He is also active in the field of public history. He has curated several major museum exhibits on American history and appeared in several historical documentaries. He also has created video lecture courses on American history for the Teaching Company, including Turning Points in American History and America in the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. Dr. O'Donnell's lecture today is about a very interesting period of America's history, the late 19th century. According to his book, Henry George and the Crisis of Inequality, America's remarkable explosion of industrial output and national wealth at the end of the 19th century was matched by a troubling rise in poverty and worker arrest. As politicians and intellectuals fought over the causes of this crisis, Henry George published a radical critique of laissez-faire capitalism and its threat to the nation's Republican traditions. Henry George's book, titled Progress and Poverty, published in 1879, became a surprise bestseller and offered a provocative solution for preserving these traditions while preventing the amassing of wealth in the hands of the few. The solution was a single tax on land values. Henry George's writings and years of social activism almost won him the mayor's seat in New York City in 1886. Though he lost the election, his ideas proved instrumental to shaping a popular progressivism that remains essential to tackling inequality today. Dr. O'Donnell will talk today about Henry George's ideas and their tremendous value for contemporary debates over corporate power, government regulation, and political polarization. These are very interesting topics, and we are all looking forward to Dr. O'Donnell's speech. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Edward O'Donnell.
Thank you. All right. Thank you very much. First question is, I've got this cordless microphone, so you can hear me? Because I can move this up a little bit if I need to. All right, so I know that most of you are here because you have to be here, right? So, and that you're economics or business or finance or all of those kinds of things combined in some way, shape, or form. So I know that I take that as a challenge to make this as interesting as possible for you. And to really bring home the fact that economics and history, I'm a historian, economics and history are not separate. They're not separate disciplines. You know, economics is rooted in history. It's influenced by history. Sure, economics has lots of numbers in it, but it's very much rooted in the time and place. And we can learn now a lot in 2016 about public policy, about economic policy, about ways to improve the economy, ways to reduce inequality and so forth by looking to the past. And that's not just my view, that's the view of many, many historians. So I'm going to start off by, well, I'll start off with giving you some background, but at a certain point I'll stop talking and open things up for you to ask some questions of me. All right, so, all right, here we go. So there's my book cover. Guess who that is? I was working on this book a long time ago. That's me. That's me when I started this book. And I'll just tell you this one quick story. So this is early 90s, 91. Yeah, it's 90 or 91. Our first baby was just born. I'm in graduate school, and I met a guy on Broadway in New York City. There are 8 million people in New York City. I met a guy, he walked down the street, and he heard me say to somebody, Henry George, because I just decided to make that my doctoral thesis work way back when. And so he stopped and he talked to me and he said, oh, I'm George Collins. I'm the head of the Henry George School in New York City. You should come and talk to us someday. And then he said, it's funny I should bump into you today because I'm actually heading up to Central Park in New York City to find the Henry George tree. I said, I didn't know there was a Henry George tree. He said, yeah, some followers of his planted a tree in Central Park and I'm going to go find it. And I thought, wow, that's kind of interesting. And we made plans to talk down the road. And 5 days later, I'm in Central Park, probably, I think maybe for myself, the first time, wheeling my little baby around with my wife, and I say, hang on a second, I got to tie my shoe. And I kneel down to tie my shoe. Central Park is bigger than Monaco, right? It's 840 acres. And I kneel down to tie my shoe next to the Henry George plaque. I thought, and I had the camera with me. It was an amazing moment. Anyway, life's what happens when you're busy making other plans. I was making other plans, and this is going to be my first book. It turns out to be my fourth book. I will spare you the details. But anyway, it's so long ago that my oldest, who is now 26, used to ask me about my book about Curious George when she was very little. So anyway, long story, it's a bit of an odyssey. Okay, so are we living in a second Gilded Age? It's a very interesting question. We're going to talk about the First Gilded Age in a moment. But today's New York Times, I have a Google News search, so I get all kinds of information based on keywords and all, and one of them is Second Gilded Age. And I got one notification today, Paul Krugman, you may have heard of him, important economics economist and writer for the New York Times. In his article today, he said, we're not only, I think the pull quote was, we're not just living in a second Gilded Age, we're living in a second robber baron age. He was talking about corporate behavior and so forth. Anyway, so it's a very, very relevant term. And this is a good example of where we need to know a little bit about the past in order to understand the present. So to answer that question, if in fact we are living in a second Gilded Age. All right, so just take a look at some of these titles. This is a book that came out a couple years ago. Another one, that's about 10 years ago. All of these books, and these are just a handful of them, have, oops, sorry about that, not yet ready for Piketty, but all of these books are asking the same question. And this is just a handful. And if you Google searched or you LexisNexis searched articles in magazines and newspapers, the Gilded Age, Second Gilded Age, New Gilded Age is exploding in the last 10 years as a term that journalists and politicians and people, and not just people like Bernie Sanders, are using this term. So, Thomas Piketty, you may have heard of Thomas Piketty. He wrote a book a couple years ago, 772 pages, weighs about 4 pounds, and Harvard University Press published it, hoping, and they were pretty sure it would get they'd sell a few books. They were hoping to sell 50,000 books. It has now sold 700,000 copies. So this book has really taken the world by storm, and because of its provocative thesis, which is about the rise of inequality in the last, well, depending on where you put your marker down, but certainly in the last 30 years. He's a French economist, and he talks about things that you'll start to hear, when you hear me talking a little bit more about who this guy Henry George was and what he was saying, you'll start to see that they're actually talking the same language and addressing the same problem. And one of the things he points out, among many, is that extreme inequality, not just within a society like the United States, but also throughout the world, throughout the industrialized world, on a macro level, or on a global macro level, if that's a proper term, sorry. I'm an historian, remember. Extreme inequality can be harmful to growth because it reduces mobility and can lead, this is the key part, it's not just unfair, it's not just a bummer that some people are rich and poor, it can lead to political capture by the super rich of our democratic institutions. This is a theme that reformers in the late 19th century hit on over and over again, which is that inequality undermines democracy. And this is a theme that has been with us as a society. It goes back even before the First Gilded Age. All right, so what is this Gilded Age? Let's just do a quick Gilded Age 101. Last third of the 19th century. Historians debate what the dates are, but basically the last third of the 19th century. And it's a term that was coined by Mark Twain. He co-wrote a book. This is actually the frontispiece from the book about the Gilded Age. It was a novel, and the novel is all about political corruption and scams and everything. And it's very much, in some ways, captures the go-go, kind of unbridled, pirate-like quality of the era. And historians love this term. Nobody in the Gilded Age said, hey, we're living in the Gilded Age. It's kind of a term that we've applied after the fact. And historians like me love it because it's a great metaphor, right? If something's gilded, it means it's gold on the outside. It's something not gold on the inside, right? So if you take make a bracelet out of aluminum or out of iron and you dip it in gold, it looks fantastic, right? It really is gold on the outside. But you scratch the surface and you see something much less appealing, much less beautiful on the underneath. And that's kind of like what's happening in the late 19th century. There's a lot of undeniable, amazing good and things that are incredibly exciting, which we'll detail in just a moment. But beneath the surface, there are serious, serious problems that just you simply cannot deny. And so people are very optimistic about the late 19th century, but they're also incredibly anxious. So before we get there, let's just throw some questions out here. Economists like to deal in questions. Historians really like to deal in questions. 3 big questions, right? One is industrialization compatible with republicanism? Now this sounds silly to us. We think of republicanism, democratic societies, and capitalism going hand in hand, that they're almost sort of twins, that they're inseparable. But in fact, we've only come to see it that way. That's not the case. In the late 19th century, people worried that industrialization, especially sort of big-time industrialization, not just the small-scale stuff like Lowell, Massachusetts, but big, heavy industry, Andrew Carnegie Steel, and so forth, coal mining districts, which is what we're in right now. So people wondered, are these two things, in fact, antagonistic? Does one undermine the other? This is my favorite question. This is like one of the great questions in American life. Which is more important, freedom or equality? I just think about, I teach a whole class called Competing Visions of Freedom. And because we think of freedom, if I've said, give me what are the 5 things Americans believe in? I would bet every single one of you would write freedom down, right? You'd write down maybe democracy, you might write down equality, you might write down liberty, justice, a whole bunch of terms we all love and agree on. But we never agreed on the definitions of what these things mean. And freedom is the ultimate one, right? My freedom to run my business the way I want to is impinged upon by the freedom, at least they think they have that freedom, of my workers to form a union and go on strike and try to hurt me so that I hurt my economic fortune so that then I'll pay them more money. Freedoms collide all the time, right? What's one of the greatest freedoms in American history? One of the strongest, most powerful, untouchable freedoms in American history. The freedom to own other people. For most of our history, that has been an untouchable freedom. It's long gone, but you'll have to get to the year 2111 before we hit the 50-yard line, where 50% of our history was where we owned slaves, and we've spent that same amount of time not owning slaves. That's in another century. So freedoms collide, and freedoms are not all equal. Can we regulate a capitalist economy without killing it, right? This is a big question today. It's a big question then, right? We agree there's a problem, but we're not so sure what the solution is, and we're really afraid of screwing up this amazing profit-generating, technology-generating machine known as the industrial economy. All right, so with those thoughts in the air, let's talk about this guy, Henry George. Henry George is a guy I've been living with for a really long time. All right, so here's Henry George as a young man. Quick bio. He's born in 1839 in a little town you may have heard of, not far from here, called Philadelphia. He is brought up in a middle-class family, so even though he spends his life writing and talking about poverty and inequality, he's actually he doesn't grow up in poverty. He's a poor student, he's a terrible student, and he finally, his parents just give up and yank him out of school and put him into an apprenticeship program to become a printer. And that turns out to be an amazingly fortunate decision because it gives him a job, it gives him a skill, you can actually earn a good living as a printer. But it'll pay off later when he writes this book, Progress and Poverty, in his spare time, and no one will touch it. It's too radical. They don't get it. So what does he do? He self-publishes, right? He literally borrows money, sets the type himself because he knows how to do it, and publishes the book, and then publishers pick it up. All right. So he quits school, trains as a printer. In 1857, he's restless, he's ambitious. So he's in his 20s at this point. He heads out to California to make it big, because that's where you go to make it big. And he has a really hard time. He's living in poverty. He's trying all kinds of different jobs. He's sleeping in barns. He's homeless. He's considers suicide at one point. So he's got this conflict of, he's like a lot of mid-19th century American guys. He thinks if I just work hard, this is the land of opportunity, the American dream. That phrase hasn't been invented yet, but you know what I'm saying. And yet he's failing over and over again. And initially he blames himself. And then later he starts to say, wait a minute. I'm working hard, I'm being sober, I'm trying to save money, I'm playing by the rules, and I and everybody around me seems to be falling behind. Maybe it's something larger than our personal worth and our personal merit. But he gets into journalism. That's the thing that saves him. And again, it's the printing thing. He gets a job at a newspaper as a printer, as a typesetter, and then says, hey, by the way, I could write a few editorials for you, and next thing you know, he's editing the newspaper. And he becomes a pretty good journalist out there in California, out in San Francisco, and develops a bit of a reputation for himself. He gets married, but then his struggles continue. He loses jobs, he gets jobs, his newspaper is doing great, and then it goes under. So it's a bit of a up and down struggle for him. And this is a great example of this. So this is Christmas Eve. He's 25 years old. He's got a baby and a baby on the way, and he's totally broke. And like a lot of mid-19th century people, he writes a diary where he's not just simply saying, I did this today, I did this today. It's like a confession, like he's like his own self-therapy, right? He's talking to himself in his diary saying, oh God, I got to get my crap together here. You're an adult. You've got. So what he writes here, and this is like a New Year's, even though it's Christmas Eve, it's sort of end of the year resolution here. So he says, I am determined to cultivate habits of determination, energy, and industry. Feel that I am in a bad situation and I must use my utmost effort to keep afloat and go ahead, right? So he's trying to buck himself up to get out of this economic rut that he's in with a second baby on the way. And then the last line, my favorite. Saw a landlady and told her I was not able to pay the rent. So he's just busted. So this is where he experiences poverty and the anxiety and the fear and the shame that comes with poverty. All right, so this is getting at this duality of the age, right? The Gilded Age, late 19th century, is an age of optimism and anxiety. And you can actually see some parallels there, right? We live in an incredibly exciting time period. And maybe because of your age, you don't see it quite the way that somebody that's my age does. But the kind of technology that you've all grown up with is new. When I went, you've probably heard people say this, right? When I went to college, I took a typewriter. Yeah, when I went to college, I brought a typewriter. And that's how I typed my papers my first year. And then I started using this thing called a word processor. So the wonders of technology, of medical science, there's amazing things. But we have a lot to be worried about, too. And George is going to take that couplet, that sort of good things, bad things couplet, and then he's going to make it his own. That's going to be the title of his book. We have so much progress all around us in the late 19th century, but we also have undeniable, you cannot deny it, more poverty and what seems to be increasing poverty. So let's look at the optimism side here first, right? Why are people optimistic in the late 19th century? Well, there's Grover Cleveland, president of the United States, and he says in his inaugural address, second inaugural, every American citizen must contemplate with the utmost pride and enthusiasm the growth and expansion of our country, right? The wonderful thrift and enterprise of our people and the demonstrated superiority of our free government. Free enterprise, free people, everything's awesome. This happens on March 4th, 1893. About 2 months later, the economy crashes and goes into another depression. It's an era of great depressions. So he's voicing this kind of optimism about production, about profits, about things going well, and there's no reason to be worried. And there's numbers to back this up. They're not making it up. Stuff is happening that is mind-boggling on the positive side. So look at these I won't kill you in numbers, I promise. But look at the stats on the right-hand column there. The thousands% increase in just 40 years of some of these things. This is explosive. Steel is like, it's basically nothing in 1860. People are making little steel instruments, medical instruments, and little steel this and that. And then it becomes this massive defining industry that changes everything. Steel is like, if you think about it, what's changed our world since, say, 1970? What's the one, if you had to put it in a museum exhibit, what's the one thing that's just blown everything away and changed our world? It's the silicon chip. Right? The silicon chip has just changed everything. And steel is a much bigger thing, or different kind of substance, but steel is that thing in the late 19th century. Changes everything, changes technology, transportation, changes war, changes industry, changes architecture, changes absolutely everything. So there's a lot happening here. We also have incredible events, events that will put it on the Atlantic Ocean floor from North America under the ocean and all the way to England. Which sounds so primitive, right? That sounds like a giant version of two cans and a string. If you've ever done that as a kid. But it was a world-changing event that you could get. Not only we'd already laid telegraph wire across the United States. Now globally, the world was literally shrinking. And this was an occasion for incredible national celebration, spanning the continent. The Transcontinental Railroad. Now, when you think of these locomotives, what do you think of? You think of like your grandparents taking you to like an old historic site that has a choo-choo and you go 5 miles an hour and it goes in a circle and ends up at the gift shop. Yeah, not that. These are like the space shuttle. These are like the super colliders of their day. They are the most advanced pieces of technology on Earth, these locomotives. And the fact that we've run a train all the way across the United States is a big event, celebrated everywhere across the country. Not far from here, the Philadelphia Exposition, a huge World's Fair in Philadelphia. And what's the thing that's always the number one item or number one theme of these World's Fairs? Whether it's Chicago in 1893 or Philadelphia in 1876, it's technology. Technology, technology, because it's just mind-blowing. And this is the thing that everybody went to see, which is the coreless generator. It ran 4,000 machines. One generator ran 4,000 machines. Brooklyn Bridge, which again, you look at the Brooklyn Bridge today in Manhattan, and it's beautiful, but it looks old and quaint and looks, it's got those stone archways. At the time, it was the great symbol of steel. The great symbol of, it was beautiful, but it was also this incredibly powerful piece of technology. And it defied expectations. Just think about this for a moment. Up until May of 1883, in the human mind, throughout all time, something that was strong had to have mass, right? So things that were strong were pyramids, or mountains, or dams, or forts, things that were, or cathedrals, thick, heavy stone, steel things. And what makes the Brooklyn Bridge strong are little itty-bitty thin wires thinner than piano wires that are spun into like wire rope and then hung in a certain way. So this is a mind-blow. People thought this was going to fall down, but it's actually the strongest thing, man-made thing on the planet when it opens. All right. There's also heroes. So you got events that are world, sort of tremendous celebrations. You also got heroes. Rockefeller is a rock star of the industrial industrial capitalist economy. He's Mr. Oil. Vanderbilt, Mr. Railroad, right? One of the great barons, or if not robber barons, one of the great capitalist barons of his age. J.P. Morgan, the Mr. Wall Street. So you've got these names that everybody knows. Now this will give you an idea of how heroic, or at least how well-known, how celebrity-esque many of these industrialists became. So this is Jay Gould, a guy you probably haven't heard of before, but in the late 19th century, baseball cards are invented. They're invented by tobacco companies. Tobacco companies are competing with each other, and they want you to buy their tobacco versus some other one. So one of the companies, Duke Tobacco, starts putting cards in tobacco packages. And they don't just put baseball cards. They do baseball cards like King Kelly there, but they also do presidents. They also do events in history, and they also did industrialist cards. So there's Jay Gould's baseball card, essentially, and you can see what he made his money with. That's the telegraph and the railroad. So he's a Wall Street wheeler-dealer, merger and acquirer. And the name of the series, Histories of Poor Boys Who Became Rich and Other Famous People. So it gives you an idea of the optimism of the time. It's a close-up. All right, and what about poverty? What did these optimists who said everything is great, let's just keep going, what did they say about poverty? Well, most cases they resorted to the classic definition of poverty, which was it was a personal failing. And in 1883, an organization was founded by Josephine Shaw Lowell, who is the sister of Robert Gould Shaw, if you remember the movie Glory. And she founds an organization called the Charity Organization Society. And the goal, it sounds like, well, it suggests something different to our ears. But what it really is, it's the Charity Restriction Society. She thinks, as you can see from the quotation, there's way too much charity out there. So the poor are finding so much free food, so many free bags of coal, so much subsidized rent that they're actually becoming lazy, and that's why we have poverty. It's not because we have low wages, not because we have militant actions against labor unions and so forth. And there's also, take that to another notch out on the spectrum, and you've got social Darwinism, which is this corruption of Darwin's theory of evolution and of natural selection, and essentially takes it and applies it to society around us. And this, just ponder these words. What a blessing to let the unreformed drunkard and his children die and not increase, not have more children, above all others. What benevolence to let the lawless perish and the prudent survive. Where did this cruel, cold, hard approach to poverty come from? The best-selling Christian magazine in the United States, The Christian Advocate. They said, this is just the way it works. So we can't interfere with poverty. We need to let the poor die, let the drunkards die, and that's just the way it goes. That social Darwinism becomes a very popular ideology in the late 19th century. Okay, so now let's switch gears. Now, those are the optimists. That's why they say everything's going great. We don't really need to mess with it. There's also, but people are anxious. So they're anxious about a number of things. Let's look at them in turn. One is growing poverty. Whenever I show this image, I ask people, what book comes to mind? What literature comes to mind? Anybody want to take a stab? Dickens, Charles Dickens, right? This looks like, if you've read David Copperfield or A Christmas Carol or any of the Dickens, Tale of Two Cities, it's a lot of the stories are set in big cities where there are lots of poor people, haves and have-nots. And that's the intent of this artist. Because this artist knows something about Americans, which is that Americans, from the moment we declared independence in 1776, we began telling ourselves we're not European, we're not European, we're not European. We're American, and we don't have kings, we don't have queens, we don't have classes, we don't have aristocrats, we don't have fixed, established churches, we don't have revolutions because everybody's, equal and so forth. And when Americans see this image of New York City, and this is the 1876, and it's on the cover of the best-selling magazine in the United States, it's telling them something. It's saying, or it's asking a question. Are we becoming European? Now, not ethnically European. Are we becoming politically European? Are we becoming like France with aristocrats, king and queen, and incredible poverty at the lower level? And that's a big question that people are asking. And note, the other thing is, this is not in the Socialist Weekly, right? This is not in the Knights of Labor Monthly. This is in Harper's, which is read primarily by middle-class and upper-class Americans. So this is not some fringy radical idea. This is centerpiece of political dialogue in the late 19th century. Walt Whitman is the great poet, right? And if you read Walt Whitman, which you should, Walt Whitman is one of the most effusive celebrators of America and the promise of America and this incredible democracy that's evolving. But he's nervous by 1879. And just take a note of his words here. If the United States, like the countries of the old world, see what he's doing? He's saying, are we sliding? Are we becoming like France, like England, like Italy, like Russia, God forbid? If the United States, like the countries of the old world, are also to grow vast crops of poor, desperate, dissatisfied, nomadic, miserably waged populations, then our Republican experiment, notice the blue, think of the Gilded Age metaphor, the surface, notwithstanding all its surface successes, right, all those factories, all those railroads and so forth, is at heart an unhealthy failure. He's actually raising that question. Are we destroying our Republican society, unwittingly? Okay. So so we're worried about poverty. We're also worried about big business. This may shock you, but over 100 years ago, corporations had enormous power in Congress and in the political process. That's a joke. You can laugh. Okay. So the bosses of the Senate, this is 1889, and you can see it's pretty clear what they're saying, right? The little itty-bitty childlike men are senators, and they are supposed to be the representatives of the people, and yet who's really calling the shots? It's these huge, bloated corporations. And look closely, they're shaped like money bags. The message is very clear that Congress is being controlled by these trusts, by these huge, huge, powerful trusts. Notice also some of the details. They're coming in through what entranceway? the entrance for monopolists. And if you look in the far corner, in the way back, you'll see a door that says people's entrance, and it's boarded shut. Right? So democracy is kept out, trusts are let in, and then if you really need help figuring it out, it says this Senate is of the monopolists, by the monopolists, for the monopolists. And again, this appears in Puck magazine, right up there with Harper's Weekly. This is not a radical publication. This is a mainstream publication that is saying, we've got a problem here that we need to address. We're not sure what to do, we've got a problem. And here's another one, also from Puck magazine. And you can see you've got your industrialists in the corner there on the far left, and they're all recognizable people. That's Vanderbilt, that's Jay Gould, that's many people that people would readily recognize. And that's their guy, right? The locomotive / knight. Now, why is knight? Why is the image of a knight particularly apt for this? Because they're saying, what does a knight come from? A knight comes from medieval Europe, right? Kings and queens and aristocrats and that. So they're saying this is not just a powerful entity, it's a powerful entity that is fundamentally undemocratic, unrepublican. And here's our guy, the people's guy. This little scrawny worker, he's on a horse labeled poverty. Look at the people behind. The American people are tired, they're thin, they're anxious about what's happening. And this is a completely unfair fight. And he's noticed them. And in fact, the word monopoly is one of the big words of this period. And in fact, it's the word that Paul Krugman's article, which I mentioned earlier, in today's New York Times, focuses on that word. All right, so you get the idea. A lot of people are worried about this big business. Their anxiety over increased inequality. So not just that there's a lot of poverty, but there seems to be a growing gap between rich and poor. I won't kill you with numbers, but here's another set. In 1890, 1%, the 1%, this is the first time in America where we start talking about the 1%. They own 51% of all wealth. The lower 44% own just 1.2%. So you're talking about probably the most extreme inequality in American history. And just to give you comparative terms, I don't have any numbers later than 2010, so this number is actually probably increased. But the top 1% owned in 2010 35% of all wealth, and that was up from 20% in 1979. It's probably closer to 40% now in 2016. So it's on the rise, which is why inequality is such a big topic of discussion, not just here in the US, but also throughout the industrialized world. And there's other things to worry about, right? Are we becoming a European society? Are we developing a new American aristocracy every bit as bad as the ones in Europe? Well, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that we are. Here are the rich in America. The rich in America are dressing up. This is Mrs. Vanderbilt. Mrs. Vanderbilt has a new house on Fifth Avenue, but I'll show you a picture of it. It's not a house, it's a palace. Who lives in palaces? Not Republican citizens. I guess they do now, right? But up until this point in American history, no American other than a few plantation-owning Southerners would dare live in an opulent mansion. It was considered un-Republican, un-American. But by 1883, they're saying, if you've got it, baby, you flaunt it. You've got boatloads of cash. Build a palace for yourself. Build a palace for your kids. And so she has a housewarming party. Invites the top upper crust of New York City to come, and it's a costume party. She dresses like the Statue of Liberty because she's super cool, but everybody else dresses like royalty. They dress like Marie Antoinette, Louis XIV, and so forth, which is literally unthinkable. You couldn't have gotten just pick Thomas Jefferson to dress like Louis XIV. He would say, no way. That's just not who we are, not even to pretend. We don't even want to pretend to be European royalty, but that's changed now. Okay, and there's the house. That's a palace, Fifth Avenue, Manhattan. In fact, if I had shown you just this image, and you'd been to Versailles in France, you would think you were looking at a room from the palace in Versailles, right? So this is a kind of a strange change in our political culture, that it's okay to not only be rich, but to really act like a king, to act like a queen. Now, here's one of my most favorite facts. Anybody know who that is? You get really extra points. You get extra dessert. All right. So what's a dollar princess? Anybody know? Anybody see Titanic? Movie Titanic. All right. So here's the thing. In 1890, there's this new class of Americans who have mountains of newly minted money, new money. Rich industrialists. Right? So they've got everything except class. They've got huge amounts of money, but they don't have, legitimacy in their own eyes. In Europe, it's the opposite. All the royal families in, particularly in England, but also throughout Europe, throughout Western Europe, they've got the class, they've got the bloodlines, they've got the DNA, they've got the coat of arms, they got the castle, they got the 60,000-acre estate, and they don't have a dime or a shilling. Right? This is where Downton Abbey. The whole point behind Downton Abbey is to save this estate, and all the other estates of their friends are falling apart. Well, it's a perfect marriage, right? If you're European and you want to keep your castle and your 60,000 acres, you get your son to marry an American girl, American woman, with boatloads of money. That is Winston Churchill's mom. Winston Churchill's British, but he's half American, right? So Lady Randolph, she's Jenny Jerome. She is a daughter of a nouveau riche guy in New York named Jerome, and the Churchill family approaches them. They have a 3-month-long negotiation. It's like signing a free agent pitcher, and at the end of which they work out the terms, the financial terms, and the marriage takes place, possibly explaining why it was such a bad, unhappy marriage, and Winston Churchill had a miserable upbringing. Anyway, but just look at these numbers. All these dollar princesses. If you remember in Titanic, there's 2 moments in the movie Titanic where this comes out. One is there's this woman, the Duchess, right? And they keep talking about the Duchess. She's in a bunch of scenes. She's clearly American, but she's a Duchess. The other is when, what's the creepy guy's name? Cal, the fiance. He puts that huge rock around Rose's neck, and he says to her, "We are the new royalty, Rose. We are the new royalty." And it's perfect. Somebody knew what they were talking about when they wrote that screenplay. Okay, Jenny Jerome. Yeah, and there's Cora, right? She's the dollar princess in Downton Abbey. Her family's an industrialist family, and what are their names? The Crawleys. The Crawleys need the money. It's a perfect marriage. All right, back to America. So poverty. Worried about poverty, worried about big business and its influence on politics, worried about robber barons and their bad behavior, worried about explosive social conflict throughout the country. And there are many of these episodes that are truly chilling to an American populace. This is Haymarket in 1886, a labor rally that goes awry, people still wondering what exactly happened. But anyway, 7 policemen were killed in this. It's called a riot, it's not really a riot. But just look at these numbers. In 20 years, the last 20 years of the 19th century, you have almost 40,000 strikes. If you go back before 1881 to 1776, so in over 100 years, you probably had 2,500 strikes, maybe not even that many. And certainly nothing big, nothing to write home about. But from 1881 to 1900, 37,000 strikes, and some of these are huge strikes. 3 of the biggest ones in American history occur in that time period. So these are big strikes. Hundreds of people are killed in these strikes. Somewhere between 500 and 800 Americans are killed between 1870 and 1914. So the time frame's a little bit bigger. So it's raw, full-on violence. It makes people really nervous because that's what do Americans associate with that kind of violence? They say that's what happens in Europe, right? All those angry poor people in Europe, they rise up and have their revolutions. We don't have revolutions in America. We only needed one. Okay. Just another angle on this. Why do we have Labor Day? When was Labor Day invented? That's Labor Day. Labor Day is invented in 1882 in New York City. And just think about what Labor Day is. Labor Day is essentially workers saying, hey, don't forget about us. You wouldn't have any of this without us. And we're getting screwed. And that's not just bad for us. That means the Republic is going down the drain. So workers in New York say, we've got to get this message out. So let's have a day to celebrate labor and to remind the rest of the country that we matter, and as our fortunes go, so goes the fortunes of the nation. And that catches on in New York, it catches on everywhere else. By 1894, it's a federal holiday. That tells you something. This is what historians look for. Why do we invent Labor Day in this period, and what's its point? It's telling us that people think something's gone wrong. All right, so what do people do about this? Let's turn the corner here and start thinking about responses. Well, there are lots of different responses. So a lot of people write books. One of the most famous books, besides Henry George's book, is by Edward Bellamy. And he writes the book Looking Backward. He describes himself as a socialist. It's not, he's sort of a socialist, and he actually doesn't use the word socialist. He uses the word nationalist. But anyway, this becomes a best-selling book. He has a guy fall asleep and wake up in Boston in the year 2000, and everything's perfect. All that conflict has gone away because the country has become a socialist utopia. Big best-selling book, has a huge national following. And it's a kind of the fact that a book like that could be so popular tells you something. And then there's our guy, Henry George. He writes a book a little bit earlier than that and garners a big national following. And his thing, as we mentioned, is this tension between undeniable progress and undeniable poverty. What are we going to do about it? And there's this book. So George, in his spare time, he's only got a 6th grade education, which makes this an amazing story. But he's a smart guy, and he reads voraciously. He reads every economics book he can get his hands on, Adam Smith and Ricardo and Malthus and all the rest, and literally in his spare time writes this amazing book. 500 pages, a sort of a survey. Well, it's hard to even describe it. I'll just give you a couple of quotations that kind of get you to understand what he was talking about, right? So he says, what's gone wrong? We've got lots of progress, but the progress is this wedge, like a chisel. He says, it's as though an immense wedge were being forced not underneath society. If a wedge goes underneath society, what happens? Everybody gets lifted, right? It's a good thing. All boats rise, to use John F. Kennedy's phrase, mix our metaphors a little bit. But he says, no, it's going through society. So it's lifting some and crushing the others. That's the problem. We need to find out why this is occurring, and we got to figure out a way to stop it because we're running out of time. And this is another one of his ideas. We hear this talk about climate change, that there may be a certain point at which if climate change keeps going, you reach a tipping point and it can't be stopped, it sort of gains momentum. Henry George is saying the same thing about inequality. That everywhere it is evident that the tendency to inequality cannot go much further or get much worse without carrying our civilization into that downward path, which is so easy to enter and so hard to abandon. So like we're racing into this world of inequality and threatening our institutions, and if we don't stop it as soon as possible, it's going to be too hard. It's going to have so much momentum that it's just going to carry us, again, to mix metaphors, over a cliff. And we need to find a way to do it. So he says the problem is, this is summarizing 500-something pages in a couple of words, the problem is monopoly. That monopolization of resources gives people special advantages. Those special advantages create more advantages, create more advantages, create more advantages, and next thing you know, there's a handful of people in control of all the key resources in a society. So it creates this destructive inequality. His solution is a kind of a quirky thing, at least to some people. It's called the single tax. And we'll not bore you to death with what that is, but he'd get rid of all other taxes, so people like that idea, and he'd impose one tax on the value of land. And his idea was that this would, among many things, would eliminate speculation. It would force land and resources into circulation, so to speak, so that it would create opportunity for more people, and that people who wanted to game the system, who wanted to grab hold of all the coal mines or all the railroads could not do it because they couldn't afford it, because the tax created this disincentive for them to do that. All right, so Progress and Poverty, written by a guy with a 6th grade education, self-published and then picked up by a major publisher after that in 1879, goes on to be a bestseller. And oddly enough, George's biggest, first sort of mass audience were workers. These guys staging the first Labor Day parade. They liked the book. They probably didn't understand Ricardo and all that other stuff, but there's a lot of stuff, even just those 2 quotations I gave you. Very poetic, very well written, lots of references to the Bible. So stuff that even somebody with a 5th grade education could easily understand. Why does he appeal to workers? There's a couple of things here. One is, you saw that earlier version where I pointed out that when people explain poverty, they said it's the workers' fault. They're fundamentally lazy. It's their own fault, and we should do nothing about it. George says, poverty is not inevitable. Poverty is man-made. Our decisions, our institutions, our policies, our choices, that's what creates poverty. And therefore, we can uncreate it, right? We can change those policies to eliminate poverty. So this idea that it's inevitable and you don't have to worry about it and you just have to kind of buck up and bear it is fundamentally wrong. And here's, in a nutshell, the way a worker, this guy's a telegraph operator, I think. And he writes this letter to a labor newspaper sort of explaining why we are so into Henry George, and at this point, why we want him to be mayor of New York City. And he says, Progress and Poverty reversed all this, meaning all this talk about poverty being inevitable and workers' fault. Poverty is a condition of man's invention. Working men and women learning all this commenced to wrestle with their chains, and that's what happens in 1886. So 1886 is one of those tumultuous years. There are probably 5 years in American history that are in that category of revolutionary upheaval years. 1968 was one, and 1886 was one, 1860 with the Civil War, 61 with the Civil War beginning. So this is a big strike in New York City, one of hundreds that year. To make a long story short, there's a big crackdown on labor. Lots of labor activists are arrested everywhere, all across the country. And so workers form labor parties to try to push back against this. And in New York, they want to choose a guy that's going to get more than 50 votes, because that's usually what happens. When you have a labor candidate, you find Fred the bricklayer, he runs, he gets totally annihilated, everybody's angry, they feel like they've wasted their money. So they choose a guy who's popular, he's an intellectual, he's an author, he's globally known by now, but he's also a card-carrying member of the Typographers Union. They know he's a member of the Knights of Labor as well. So he seems to be that perfect hybrid of high-profile guy, but also a real-deal worker. He runs against Abram Hewitt, who was a congressman, and some guy named Theodore Roosevelt, who's not yet famous, but he will be famous eventually. And the press and everybody else gangs up on Henry George, as one might suspect, because then they try to brand him as this wild-eyed communist who's going to, threatens to destroy America and so forth. And you can see how the way this was depicted. They're showing a worker here, so the guy in the middle is a worker, and behind him is Satan, right? He's like a communist agent, and he's saying, "Go with Henry George. He's the guy. He's the guy." And there's Henry George. He's the guy who's the real deal. He's going to save you. And so they're saying, don't be deluded by this talk of utopia. The Statue of Liberty is new at this point, right? It's literally unveiled a few days before the election of 1886 in New York. And you can see this cartoon it says, "Our Statue of Liberty, she can stand it." And what they're saying is there's all these threats to America at this point. Socialism, communism, anarchism, and the one that's really right in the center is Georgism. So lumping him together in that. So there's a big campaign of, I'm going to skip over this just so we can get to the end. So a big campaign of anti-George activity. And of course, how many newspapers does the Labor Party control? One. And they started it on October 1st, right? And it was a tiny little newspaper. But George overcomes that by staging a Democratic campaign. We'd be used to this today. It was totally new in those days to campaign, and they called it a tailboard campaign. Get on a wagon and go all across the city all night long. Give 10, 15 speeches, go to a factory, go to a train station, and just give speech after speech after speech, and it really starts to work. They start to realize we're getting, I guess today you'd say, we're getting traction. In the end, George doesn't get 50 votes, he gets 68,000. He loses, but he finishes higher than Teddy Roosevelt, which is pretty amazing. And he's within a margin of defeat that is pretty close. And I break this down in my book showing how little would have had to have happened for George to have actually won the election. And there's all kinds of allegations of stealing votes, not on his part, but on the Hewitt side. So when they win, they almost win, and they take this as a moral victory. And so for workers in this period, they see this as a temporary setback, and we're on our way to greater things, and we're eventually going to form a third party, and that third party is going to save the republic. And look at George; he's kind of a Hercules figure there. And the statement is we need to be ready for the next round because they're going to come at us even harder, but we're ready for it. George predicts at that night when he loses the election, he says it's basically Bunker Hill. Temporary setback, but the future is ours. We are on our way to resurrecting this society, resurrecting our country, getting it back on track. Well, to make a long story short, it all falls apart. The labor movement goes into disintegrates it doesn't disintegrate, but the unity that it had going up to 1886 starts to fall apart. It falls apart for lots of reasons. Not the least of which is a full-on campaign by business to make it fall apart, but also internal dissent and so forth. And Henry George kind of fades from the scene, certainly in this labor scene, fades quite a bit. He's still around for another decade, still writes, still is popular, but the movement sort of goes off in a different direction. So what do we know about him? What's important about Henry George now? Well, we've already talked about a couple of them, but one is, if you look at the people who, when they write their autobiography, the famous reformers of the next generation, the 1890s, the early 20th century, the progressive era, and this is if these names don't jump off the page, you'll have to trust me, they're wicked famous, as we say in Massachusetts. So Upton Sinclair, right? All of these people say the same thing. The reason I became a reformer was somebody handed me a copy of Progress and Poverty when I was 14 years old, or when I was in high school, and I read that book, and that sent me on my path to become a great reformer. So this is literally like a top 20 list, and this is just a small sample of that list of people who were deeply influenced by his message. Not specifically the single tax, more the broad picture, which I'll get to in just a moment by way of closing. John Dewey, one of the great thinkers and intellectuals of the early 20th century, maybe exaggerating a little bit, but he wrote of Henry George, he said he's one of the great names among the world's social philosophers. And he says basically, he's one of the top 10 greatest thinkers, right up there with Plato. So giving him a lot of credit for being this kind of influential figure. Another thing about the legacy, another thing you can look up on your own, but the game Monopoly, talk about an ironic twist, was invented by a Henry George follower who wanted to show how bad Monopoly was. And to make a long story short, somebody stole the game from her at a certain point, sold it to Parker Brothers, and made a lot of money on it. And the whole point of the game Monopoly is to do what? Is to win by becoming a monopolist. So the whole thing is kind of inverted. There's a new book came out a couple years ago about that story. All right, couple things, final thoughts. Relevance of Henry George. Henry George, the broad picture, not necessarily the single tax, but the whole broad picture of what he was saying, the things that matter, and the things that matter now in this period, whether or not you want to call it a Gilded Age, is that extreme inequality threatens democracy, and he explains why. That the market is not a magical self-correcting thing. It is something that we possess, that we created, and that we can make choices about. And that inequality is the choice, and it will destroy democracy. Second, we think in this era, most public talk you hear in this era is about individualism, right? We've had every generation or so we get this big spike in people who call themselves libertarians, right? Libertarianism, you can track it by book sales, by things. People say, oh, I'm a libertarian. So we're now in this like big libertarian moment. I'm not going to say anything about libertarianism, except that it's a childish. Everybody should be a libertarian for about 18 months between the ages of 16 and 23. But and then you wake up and you say, oh, that's freaking crazy, and doesn't make any sense. But it's an interesting intellectual position to have. But it's divorced from reality. But anyway, that was a little editorializing on my part. Sorry. So there are two traditions in American life that have been there from the very, very beginning. I'm talking 1607, the very beginning. Two traditions, not individualism by itself. Yes, we are an individualist society. Yes, we love individualism. We prize it. We need to protect individualism. We need to honor it. It's a really, really important thing, and it's one of the things that makes us Americans. However, we have also always cherished and always nurtured and always attended to and always tried to protect the common good. All the way back to 1607. Way, way back in the beginning. It's always there. It's there in Jefferson. It's there in Madison. It's in all the founders. It's in the Constitution that we care about the common good. And we have to find a way. These things are antagonistic, right? They're not necessarily at war with each other, but they're antagonistic. They compete with each other. We need to find that balance between the common good and individualism. And so that's what Henry George is talking about. That's what Bernie Sanders is talking about. And other people in the political ring today is talking about pulling the pendulum back towards the common good. It's way over on the individualism side, and we need to pull it back towards the common good a little bit more. And then finally, that when we start to think about how to solve our social problems, that we need to realize, like it or not, that the government, some level of the government, is part of the solution. Because we also, not only do we talk way too much about individualism these days and exclude the common good, we also talk about the government as the enemy. But the government, Civics 101, the government is us. And we can decide what we want it to be and what we want it to do. And so that's really what Henry George's message was all about. Not so much the specific details of his plan, but these kind of broad social, political points that he was trying to make. And that's really what makes him relevant today in 2016, 120-something years after he died. And that slide means I'm done. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was a very interesting and very informative speech. We have like 10-15 minutes for questions, so please feel free to ask.
All right. So who has a question? Anybody have a question? I know some of you have to go, so it's okay, just go. You got class and stuff, that's fine. But does anybody have any questions? Anybody want to challenge me on my libertarianism riff? No? No? Did you have a question? So if you care about inequality today, I guess the question is to me, like what do I see? Well, here's where history is important. What would we choose to say is one of our better moments, our better time periods? When have we been the richest and the least unequal, if that's a proper phrase to use, right? When have we been as rich as we've ever been, as prosperous as we've ever been, and enjoyed the lowest level of inequality? 1945 to 1970. In that time period, we had explosive growth, and in a way, to a degree, it's a bit of an anomaly, right? But we also had massive investment in education. The GI Bill and many other programs put education at the forefront, saying educated, trained American workforce is our best economic investment. So if you're a kid growing up in California in 1964, and you were 18 years old, you could go to college, to some of the best colleges in the world for basically free. Basically for free. And now, what is Berkeley, what are these California colleges, public institutions cost now? They're not at $65,000 like Harvard, but they're way up there. It's far, far beyond. And if you adjust for dollars, for inflation, it's really pretty extreme. So that's one example of something that we were doing well and that we've gone away from. If you want to see a film that kind of succinctly and in kind of a fun, easily accessible way, Inequality for All. It's Robert Reich's film, right? So Reich is a lefty. He's a unabashed progressive, but he shows you with data how all this works out. And he also says what other countries are doing this. Germany. Right? He puts up a picture of an iPhone, and he says, who gets the money from the iPhone? What countries get the money, make money off the manufacture of and sale of iPhones? And he's teaching at Stanford, so he's got a big classroom just like this. And people just, answers. And everybody thinks China gets the most, right? Because they make it. It's made over there in China. China gets like 4%. Like this ridiculously small piece. To make a long story short, Germany gets the biggest chunk. Because Germany has this unbelievably highly trained workforce with industrial technology, and that workforce is making all the super complicated parts that go into the iPhone. So Germany, because they invest very heavily in their education, including they have vocational programs and things, that workforce is ready to take on those jobs. And we have a little of that here, but we don't have nearly as much as we could. So that's one kind of long answer. Anybody else have a question? And we have a microphone here too. I should have pointed out. So anybody else have a question? Yep. That's a good. Well, I mean, I would take Sanders at his word. I mean, I'm not saying he could do it because it's politics, it's democracy. We have these divided. We have the system that we have, but Sanders is very explicit about it. He'd raise the minimum wage. He would invest a lot more money, just as I was saying, in education. In fact, he says, make public education on up through the college level, public college should be free. Because that's what Germany does and other countries does. So just those two things alone. He would also change our trade policies. I mean, again, he says he would. I think he means it. So that we aren't, at least in his mind, signing things like the TPP, which he believes would lead to the further exodus of American jobs to places like Mexico or the Philippines and so forth. So those are probably, I guess that's the top three that I can think of that he would say, this is what we need. And he's looking at that post-war period too. He's saying we were doing some things well, not perfectly, right? There's never been a moment where, make America great again. Sure, we've been great, but we've always said, if in 1955 we were at our height of prosperity and equality, we were also fundamentally segregated, right? The civil rights movement is just beginning to blow up at that point because we are such a, there's a part of our society that is so unjust that needs to be fixed.
Just real quickly.
Oh, yes.
An example of Germany. My understanding is that in Germany, 10th graders, so they actually give them strangers instead of humans, technical schools,
Yep.
or college. So you think something like that would work over there, or some of them too?
I think the question is, in Germany, about the 9th grade, 8th or 9th grade, you take exams, and I don't know exactly how it works, but you do start to, by age 14, you're like on a track. You know, you're going to go into industrial technology, you're going to go into manufacturing, or you're going to go into university. So they have this kind of tracking system that kicks in about age 14, age 15. I don't think something like that would work here, but I think the option for something like that would work here. I mean, we have hundreds of millions of high school kids that do go to vocational school, but have anybody looked at vocational education today? You know, you've got kids who are in automotive class or in welding classes or in, first of all, very little of it is high tech. You know, so the kids are not, what do kids today who want to get those great jobs making, you know, chips and doing the kind of really super high tech stuff? They need to know trigonometry. Not a lot of math, they just need to know basic trig. So they can get, it's not being taught in our vocational schools. Because in many of our vocational schools, this is all part of the, the advanced placement epidemic and testing epidemic that has taken over our schools. But there are guys who teach, I know a friend of mine who teaches math in a really well-funded Massachusetts vocational school, and I say, you must be teaching trigonometry so these kids can do these laser-guided precision cutting tool stuff. He goes, nope. Our principal is trying to get all of our kids to go to college. So they're in vocational school, but the emphasis on the curriculum is for them to go to college, which seems to me to be completely opposite. They've got to do one or the other. If college is not for everybody. So I think some way of fixing the system we have now, not necessarily rigidly tracking people, because that would be essentially un-American, but having those options and having them be really good options, where and there are many programs out there where business leaders are working, in certain communities where businesses are working with vocational schools, saying, look, we'll give you some money if you do these things, because this is what we want. We want graduates who come work for us right away. They got to learn trigonometry. They got to learn, basic things. But they're all sort of pilot programs. So if they could be scaled up in some way to be the American version of that, I think it would work. It certainly work better than it is now. So, anybody else have a question? Yep. Okay, we got to.
I just had a comment. You were talking about college not being for everybody. It was interesting. I was looking at some statistics, and it showed that the poverty rate for college-educated people is much lower than for people with only a high school education and with people with less than a high school education. But there was one factor that was even more dramatic than education level, and that was marriage. So single parents, that's where the poverty is. And if you change that from single parenthood to marriage, the poverty level goes way down.
It's true, but the first part is what's more expensive. What's the only thing more expensive than going to college? Not going to college, right? It's a big difference in your income, your earning potential. College is not going to college. But the marriage thing, it's a subject of intense research, debate, and public policy, argument. There's no question that a stable two-parent family home tends to have much better economic outcomes, and also pass on to their children. But the solution, how do you make people get married? What do you do to encourage marriage? It's a very, very vexing, difficult issue with a lot of research on this. But another way to look at it is to flip around and say, what is it that drives people apart? What is it that satisfies? What is it that makes marriages never actually happen, or that they fall apart quickly, and that we have left in the next day? And there's a direct correlation of all these research with poverty. Poverty is unbelievably bad. Poverty is really bad on your health as well, bad on your mental. Marriage is difficult. I've been lucky enough for 28 years. And, it's mostly awesome, but it's also there's times where it's really, really difficult. And difficult because when the kid is sick, marriage is good, or you're flat broke. I've been Henry George about this. Thankfully, it's been a while since I've been I mean, it really tears at a relationship, stress.
So some people would argue, and I think I'm more in that camp, which is that if everyday hardworking people can earn good living, a decent living, some people bring them to say if you work 40 hours a week, you shouldn't be living in poverty. So that's the argument on living minimum wage. If you create conditions where financially people are better off, you probably would have lower divorce rates and therefore more impact payments and maybe more successful outcomes. But otherwise, that's the only way I can see how you can,
Encourage marriage or encourage that kind of.
Answer your question, or?
Well, I just wanted to put it out there because it's never talked about.
Well, I wouldn't say it's
Yeah.
never talked about. I think
Yeah.
in conservative circles, it's been a
Yeah.
big topic for 40 years. And it's at various times kind of worked its way into discourse about public policy and ways.
Well, I mean, it should be front and center, I think,
You see it all gets into tricky territory, right?
Yeah.
Morals and values and
Yeah.
what things you say. You, get married. You stay married now. It's just hard to do it. So maybe do it better conditions.
It's a good question. Don't we? Does the United States spend more on the federal level than any other comparison country, like our comparison countries? I don't know the answer, but I would highly doubt that. And I think it's like any number. It may be true, but it also may be, for example, our higher education is so expensive, so maybe our government does spend more money than, but it's doing that because the system is so expensive. So, but I don't know, and it's per capita. I don't know those numbers, but I don't know if anybody else does know those numbers. But anybody else have a question? Yep, in the back. Maybe we can get the microphone back that way. Yeah, so how do we increase the incentives for, so this is where I'm talking out of my broad reading of stuff. I'm not an economist, but I mean, I'm not really sure about that answer. I do fundamentally believe that public policy, whether trade policy, tax policy, I mean, there have been some studies that show that some of our tax policy actually encourages, there's like incentives to export jobs to other countries. And so, I mean, there are businesses, manufacturing businesses in industrialized societies all around the world that are making making a lot of profit and doing well, and they live in places with incredibly high taxes. Sweden and Denmark and France. I mean, they've found a way to hold on to a lot of their industry and to hold on to their industry somehow and not have it be exported. So through incentives, but also through penalties. I mean, the Panama Papers are just the tip of the iceberg. When we're going to this release of documents, we're going to find out a lot more about not just individuals and rock stars and movie stars that have hid their money, but the kind of big-time financial games that corporations are playing. Shielding money and shifting jobs. I think those are two. And they're two parts of a similar problem, of the same problem. I don't know if that was a good answer or not. Maybe I'm getting weary here. Anybody else have a question? Yep, in the way back. Yes. Yeah, I mean, so the question is, George talks about the common good. He really stands for the common good. And where does this come from? Well, he says it comes right out of our traditions, that we've always been, about the common good. The Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. But George is a very deeply religious person. So he also quotes the Bible a lot too, and says, you know, it's the only moral way to go is to attend to the common good. And he references, you know, in ancient Israel, X, Y, and Z, and Jesus said this. So he's combining kind of republicanism and Christianity in a very compelling kind of formula to say. And he says, look, our history tells us that we've done this before. You know, I always ask groups like this, where in the Constitution does it say we should have public education? It doesn't. But in the 1830s, smart people in America said, hey, we better educate these, you know, all these immigrants, all these, you know, people moving from the country to the cities. We're going to go off the rails if we don't create an education system. It's going to cost us all a little bit of money. You're going to lose a little bit of your liberty. Chill out. The payoff's going to be pretty awesome. And so we invented public education. It's not in the Constitution. It's in state constitutions, but it's not in the American Constitution. We just said that's a problem we need to tackle. And so George would cite examples like that, just saying common sense. This is common sense stuff. Yep.
One more question.
Thank you.
Okay.
I would like to make a comment and see what you think about it. I've been taught that I should treat people with justice, not equality, because sometimes when you give people equal things, you are not just with them. And I'm aware of many countries that is somehow give equal opportunities to their citizens. For example, some Gulf countries, they have some free education, a lot of opportunities for their citizens, but they are not doing well, and they are actually trying to implement the American system.
So where is this happening?
In some Gulf countries, for example. So I think giving people equality is not a solution for the crisis of this era and this country.
Okay, so I will agree with you, but let's be clear. To agree. So it comes down to definitions, right? Remember when I talked about freedom? We all love freedom, but we don't agree what it means. Inequality is the same thing. When Bernie Sanders or Henry George or anybody talk about equality, they don't really mean equality. They mean less inequality, right? So everybody typically agrees that some level of inequality is both inevitable and to a certain degree desirable, you know, because it creates incentive systems and so forth. So when we talk about the problem of inequality, we're really talking about the problem of extreme, and in this case, worsening inequality. And so a lot of social reformers, like Henry George and others, would not call for, you know, everybody gets the same size house, everybody gets the same size car, everybody makes the same amount of money, but they would say, let's have certain things be equal, right? Let's have everybody gets an awesome education. I mean, back to that question about what can we do to get ourselves back on track as a society. I mean, just do a little bit of reading about our educational system, you know, and how it's funded and how crazy it is, how unbelievably unequal our urban systems are versus our suburban systems and so forth. So if we could find a way to you know, in the same way that we, I mean, there's certain things we agree on. And so if we could have everybody, what most of our comparison countries do is they say, healthcare, we're not even going to debate it. Everybody gets access to healthcare. That's the way it should be. It's like oxygen. It's like education. It's like anything else. Just would take that off the table. So your daily struggles, your daily decisions, you don't have to worry about healthcare. And you don't have to worry about, you know, you don't have to worry about invading armies, right? We'll take that off the table too. No invading armies. We'll take, what about educate? We'll take education off the table too. Everybody gets access to education. So I think those are the fundamental things. And then the rest, in a free market system, understanding what free market means, that it's not some magical, it's not like, you know, there's not the law of gravity and the law of thermodynamics and the law of the free market. They're not the same thing. But a dynamic system that it has incentives and all would work. So I would agree with you. And the problem with a lot of those Gulf countries is that they are single resource countries, right? They just make all their money on one. It's the curse of that, you know, the curse of oil in a lot of ways, you know, which is why they're not democracies, among other things. So, all right, I think that's it, folks. You've been great. I know you all didn't need to be here, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much for attending the event. So this concludes the 25th Annual Spring Henry George Seminar. Thank you.
All right.
Great job for you.
Thank you.
Excellent.